A heartless CEO fires a dying employee. Hours later, his own family turns against him in court. In the heart of a bustling city, Richard Cole sat in his luxurious office, surveying his empire with a sense of smug satisfaction. As the CEO of Cole Industries, he had built his fortune on the backs of his employees, ruling with an iron fist and a heart of stone. Fear and intimidation were his weapons of choice, and he wielded them with ruthless precision. John Hanson, a dedicated employee who had served the company for over a decade, sat across from Richard, his face pale and drawn. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice trembling, "I need to take some time off. I've just been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I want to spend my final days with my family." Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'm sorry to hear that, John," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "But I'm afraid I can't grant your request. We have deadlines to meet, and I need all hands on deck." John's eyes widened in disbelief. "But sir, I've given so much to this company. Surely, you can make an exception, just this once." Richard's face hardened. "I've made my decision, John. If you can't commit to your job, then I have no choice but to let you go. Clean out your desk and leave your badge with HR." As John left the office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A woman named Sarah watched from the shadows. She had seen the exchange and felt a deep sense of injustice stirring within her. Sarah knew John well. He was a pillar of the community, a kind and generous soul who always put others first. She couldn't stand by and watch as Richard Cole destroyed lives without consequence. Sarah Turner had always been a force to be reckoned with. Born and raised in the city, she had grown up witnessing the struggles and triumphs of her community. Her parents, both social workers, had instilled in her a deep sense of empathy and a desire to fight for what was right. As she walked through the streets, her mind raced with thoughts of John and the injustice he had suffered. She knew she had to do something, but what? She was just one person, and Richard Cole was a powerful man with deep pockets and a team of ruthless lawyers. Lost in thought, Sarah almost didn't notice the elderly woman struggling to carry her groceries up the steps of her apartment building. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed over and offered to help. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, her eyes crinkling with gratitude. It's so rare to find someone willing to lend a hand these days. As Sarah helped the woman inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this small act of kindness was just the beginning of something much larger. John Hanson sat in his living room, surrounded by his family. His wife, Emily, held his hand tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. His two children, Max and Lily, sat on either side of him, their faces etched with worry. "I'm so sorry," John said, his voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I had more time." Emily squeezed his hand. "It's not your fault, John. You've given everything to that company. They should be taking care of you, not casting you aside like this." John nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled over him. He had always prided himself on being a provider, on taking care of his family. Now, he felt like a burden, a shadow of his former self. As the family sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, a knock at the door startled them. Emily rose to answer it, and Sarah stepped inside, her face etched with concern. "John," she said, her voice soft. "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry." John looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. It means a lot that you came." Sarah sat down beside him, her mind already racing with ideas. She knew she had to do something to help John and his family, but she also knew that taking on Richard Cole would be no easy feat. She needed a plan, and she needed allies. As Sarah left John's house, her heart heavy with the weight of his story, she knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone with experience, someone who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of corporate greed and corruption. She thought of her old mentor, a retired lawyer named Marcus Williams. He had been a legend in his day, taking on the biggest cases and winning against all odds. Sarah had interned for him during law school, and he had taught her everything she knew about fighting for justice. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number, her heart pounding in her chest. When he answered, his voice was just as warm and reassuring as she remembered. "Sarah, my dear," he said. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell him everything about John, about Richard Cole, about the injustice that had been done. As she spoke, she could feel Marcus's anger and determination growing through the phone. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice firm. "We cannot let this stand. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning, and we'll come up with a plan." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since John had been fired. With Marcus on her side, she knew they could make a difference. They could hold Richard Cole accountable and show the world that compassion and integrity still mattered. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Marcus's office bright and early. She found him already hard at work, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal books. "Sarah," he said, looking up from his desk, "I've been doing some digging on Richard Cole and his company. It's worse than we thought." He pushed a folder across the desk towards her. Inside were pages and pages of complaints, lawsuits, and allegations against Cole Industries. Employees claiming harassment, discrimination, and unsafe working conditions. Whistleblowers who had been silenced or pushed out of the company. It was a damning portrait of a man who cared more about profits than people. Sarah felt her anger rising as she read through the documents. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We can't let him get away with this." Marcus nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. "And we won't. But we need to be smart about this. Richard Cole is a powerful man, and he won't go down without a fight." Together, they began to formulate a plan. They would gather evidence, build a case, and rally the community behind them. They would show the world that even the most powerful men could be brought to justice if enough people stood together. As they worked, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose and clarity. She had always known that she wanted to make a difference in the world, but now she knew exactly how she was going to do it. She was going to take on Richard Cole, and she was going to win. As Sarah and Marcus began their investigation, they quickly realized that they were not alone in their fight. All across the city, people were starting to take notice of Richard Cole's misdeeds. In a small community garden, a group of neighbors gathered to share their stories. They were all employees of Cole Industries, and they had all suffered under Richard's reign of terror. Some had been fired for speaking out against unsafe working conditions, while others had been harassed or discriminated against based on their race, gender, or sexual orientation. As they talked, a sense of unity and purpose began to grow among them. They knew that they could not take on Richard Cole alone, but together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Sarah and Marcus attended the meeting, listening intently to the stories of the community. They knew that these voices would be crucial in building their case against Richard Cole. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah stood up to address the group. "I know that many of you have suffered under Richard Cole's leadership," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But I want you to know that you are not alone. Together, we can hold him accountable. Together, we can make a difference." The crowd erupted in cheers, their faces filled with hope and determination. Sarah felt a rush of pride and purpose wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but with the support of the community behind her, she knew that anything was possible. As Sarah and Marcus continued their investigation, they uncovered more and more evidence of Richard Cole's wrongdoings. They found financial records showing that he had been embezzling money from the company, using it to fund his lavish lifestyle and personal ventures. They also discovered that he had been bribing local officials to turn a blind eye to his unethical business practices. It seemed that there was no limit to the depths of his corruption. But even as they built their case, Richard Cole was not content to sit idly by. He began to use his considerable resources to fight back against Sarah and Marcus, hiring a team of high-powered lawyers to counter their every move. He also launched a smear campaign against Sarah, spreading rumors and lies about her character and motives. He painted her as a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta, rather than a concerned citizen fighting for justice. But Sarah refused to be intimidated. She knew that the truth was on her side, and she was determined to see this fight through to the end. One day, as she was leaving her office, she found a note taped to her car window. It was a message from one of Richard Cole's lackeys, warning her to back off or face the consequences. Sarah's heart raced as she read the note, but she refused to let fear control her. She crumpled the paper in her fist and tossed it aside, her resolve only strengthened by the threat. She knew that she was on the right path, and she would not be deterred. No matter what obstacles Richard Cole threw in her way, she would keep fighting until justice was served. As the pressure mounted, Sarah found herself turning to the community for support more and more. She attended neighborhood meetings and rallies, speaking out against Richard Cole's abuses and calling for change. At one such meeting, she met a young woman named Lila, who had recently been fired from Cole Industries for reporting sexual harassment by one of Richard's top executives. Lila was scared and unsure of what to do next, but Sarah saw the strength and courage in her eyes. "You did the right thing," Sarah told her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you are not alone. We will fight this together." Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just feel so powerless," she said. "Like nothing I do will ever make a difference." Sarah shook her head. "That's not true," she said firmly. "Every action we take, no matter how small, has the power to create change. We just have to keep pushing forward, even when it feels impossible." As the meeting ended, Sarah watched as the community members began to disperse, each one carrying a little more hope and determination than before. She knew that this was how real change happened, not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through the small, everyday acts of courage and kindness that brought people together. And as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors and friends, Sarah felt a deep sense of pride and purpose. She knew that, together, they could build a better world, one where justice and compassion reigned supreme, and where even the most powerful men were held accountable for their actions. As Sarah and Marcus continued to build their case against Richard Cole, they knew that they needed to find a way to bring their evidence to light. They decided to reach out to a local journalist named Ethan, who had a reputation for exposing corporate corruption and holding the powerful accountable. Ethan was initially skeptical of their claims, but as he reviewed the evidence they had gathered, his eyes widened in shock and disgust. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "I can't believe he's been getting away with this for so long." Sarah nodded. "That's why we need your help," she said. "We need to get this story out there, to show the world what Richard Cole is really capable of." Ethan agreed, and together, they began to work on a series of articles exposing the truth about Cole Industries. They interviewed former employees, uncovered financial records, and pieced together a damning portrait of a company built on greed and corruption. As the articles began to be published, the community rallied around Sarah and Marcus, showing their support through letters, phone calls, and public demonstrations. Richard Cole's reputation began to crumble, and his once untouchable facade started to crack. But even as they celebrated their victories, Sarah knew that the fight was far from over. Richard Cole was a master manipulator, and he would stop at nothing to protect his empire. One night, as Sarah was leaving the office, she was confronted by one of Richard's henchmen. The man loomed over her, his face twisted in a menacing scowl. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he growled. "You think you can take down Richard Cole? Well, think again. He's got friends in high places, and he'll crush you like a bug if you don't back off." Sarah felt a flicker of fear, but she refused to let it show. She squared her shoulders and looked the man straight in the eye. "I'm not afraid of Richard Cole," she said calmly. "And I'm not going to back down. He's hurt too many people, and it's time for him to face the consequences of his actions." The man's face flushed with anger, but before he could reply, Sarah pushed past him and walked away, her head held high. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. With the support of her community and the strength of her convictions, she would keep fighting until justice was served. As the public outcry against Richard Cole grew louder, Sarah and Marcus knew that they needed to take their fight to the next level. They decided to file a lawsuit against Coal Industries, citing the countless abuses and illegal activities that they had uncovered. The news of the lawsuit sent shockwaves through the city, and Richard Cole's once unassailable reputation began to crumble. His company's stock prices plummeted, and his board of directors began to question his leadership. But Richard Cole was not one to go down without a fight. He launched a vicious counterattack, using his vast resources to smear Sarah and Marcus in the media and intimidate potential witnesses. Sarah felt the weight of the pressure bearing down on her, but she refused to back down. She knew that this was bigger than just her own personal fight. It was about standing up for what was right and holding those in power accountable for their actions. As the lawsuit progressed, Sarah and Marcus faced countless obstacles and setbacks. But they also found strength in the support of their community, who rallied behind them in ways big and small. One day, as Sarah was walking through the neighborhood, she was approached by an elderly woman who pressed a small envelope into her hand. Inside was a check for $100, with a note that read, "Keep fighting the good fight. We're all behind you." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she read the note. She knew that this small act of kindness was just one of many that had sustained her throughout this long and difficult journey. And as she looked out at the faces of her neighbors and friends, Sarah knew that they would keep fighting, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Because they knew that, together, they had the power to create real and lasting change, to build a world where justice and compassion reigned supreme, and where even the most powerful men were held accountable for their actions. As the trial date approached, Sarah and Marcus knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. Richard Cole had assembled a team of high-powered attorneys, and they were determined to crush Sarah and Marcus's case by any means necessary. But Sarah and Marcus had a secret weapon to the truth. They had spent months gathering evidence and building a case that was airtight, and they knew that no amount of legal maneuvering could change the facts. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and employees of Coal Industries. Sarah felt a flicker of nervousness as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table, but she pushed it aside. She knew that this was her moment to shine, to show the world what Richard Cole was really capable of. As the trial progressed, Sarah and Marcus presented a damning case against Richard Cole and his company. They called witness after witness who testified to the abuses and illegal activities that they had suffered at the hands of Coal Industries. But it was the testimony of John Hanson that truly brought the courtroom to its knees. As he took the stand, his face gaunt and his voice weak from the ravages of cancer, John told his story of how he had been fired by Richard Cole for daring to ask for time off to spend with his family in his final days. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom as John spoke, and even Richard Cole's attorneys seemed to be at a loss for words. It was a moment of pure, raw emotion, a reminder of the human cost of corporate greed and corruption. As the trial drew to a close, Sarah and Marcus knew that they had made their case. They had shown the world the true face of Richard Cole, and they had given a voice to the countless victims of his abuses. And as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew that, no matter what the outcome, she had done everything in her power to hold Richard Cole. After hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned with their verdict. Sarah and Marcus held their breath as the foreman stood up to read the decision. In the case of Sarah Turner and the People versus Richard Cole and Coal Industries, we find the defendant guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Sarah and Marcus embraced, tears streaming down their faces. They had done it, they had taken on one of the most powerful men in the city and won. As the judge handed down the sentence, years in prison and millions in fines and restitution, Richard Cole's once smug facade crumbled. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head bowed in defeat. But for Sarah and Marcus, the victory was about more than just punishing Richard Cole. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. That justice and compassion would always triumph over greed and corruption. As they left the courthouse, Sarah and Marcus were met by a sea of supporters, employees of Coal Industries, community members, and activists who had been inspired by their fight. They cheered and waved signs, their faces filled with hope and determination. And as Sarah looked out at the crowd, she knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many more injustices to be righted, so many more voices to be heard. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had her community, her allies, and her own unshakable conviction that a better world was possible. And together, they would keep fighting one small act of courage at a time. In the weeks and months that followed the trial, Sarah and Marcus watched as the ripple effects of their victory spread throughout the city. Coal Industries was forced to clean up its act, implementing sweeping reforms and providing restitution to its victims. Other companies, too, began to take notice, realizing that they could no longer get away with abusing their workers and breaking the law. Slowly but surely, the balance of power began to shift as employees and activists found their voices and their strength. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. She had lost John, a dear friend and ally, to the ravages of cancer. But she knew that his legacy would live on in the lives he had touched, in the courage he had inspired, and in the change he had helped to create. She thought of him often as she continued her work advocating for workers' rights, fighting for social justice, and building a movement that would outlast any one person or any one victory. And she knew that, even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. Because she had seen firsthand the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change, to build a world where compassion and justice reigned supreme. As she looked out at the city she loved, Sarah felt a sense of pride and purpose wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. With her community by her side, and the strength of her convictions in her heart, she would keep fighting one small act of courage at a time. Years later, Sarah stood in front of a crowd of young activists, her face lined with age, but her eyes still shining with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest of times. She told them her story of how she had taken on one of the most powerful men in the city and won, of how she had found strength in her community and in her own unshakable conviction that a better world was possible. She spoke of the importance of small acts of kindness and daily choices, of how even the most seemingly insignificant actions could ripple out and create great change. She spoke of the power of hope and resilience, of the courage it took to stand up for what was right, even in the face of great adversity. And as she looked out at the faces of the young people before her, so full of passion and promise, she knew that the fight was far from over. There would always be more injustices to be righted, more voices to be heard, more battles to be won. But she also knew that, as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight for what was right, there was always hope. Because real power lay not in fear and intimidation, but in compassion and integrity, in the small acts of courage and kindness that had the power to transform the world. As Sarah stepped down from the podium, she was met with a standing ovation. And as she looked out at the sea of faces before her, she knew that her legacy would live on in the hearts and minds of all those who had been touched by her story, and in the countless acts of courage and compassion that would continue to shape the world for generations to come. Because in the end, that was what mattered most, not the battles won or lost, but the love and hope and resilience that had carried them through. And as long as that love and hope remained, Sarah knew that anything was possible.